Accidentally discovered wife's divorce plans and found way to protect my fortune. She called it a prank when her scheme failed. Be me 29 living in Phoenix? Been lurking here for months. Never thought I'd have my own story. Life has other plans though. Need to get this off my chest. Been carrying it around for too long. Been with wife Katie for 6 years. Married for 4 of them. Everything was solid, or so I thought. Had normal ups and downs. Nothing major though. We were that couple everyone envied. Real teammates through and through. Had all these dumb inside jokes. Spent hours debating what movie to watch. Just had this perfect rhythm going. She would plan these fancy date nights. I'd surprise her with Chinese food after rough days at work. Felt like we had this whole love thing figured out. Was working as an architect at a big firm. Life seemed pretty perfect. Then about 6 months ago, things started getting weird. Little things at first. Stuff you might miss if you weren't paying attention. Started taking her phone everywhere. Even just going to the kitchen. Or doing laundry. Before this, phone would just sit on coffee table for hours. Didn't care who picked it up. Made a joke one day. "What are you running some secret spy ring now?" She laughed it off. "No, just work emailing me a lot." Few days later, she put a password on her phone. That was strange. Never used one before. Asked her why. Said something vague about security. Mentioned hackers. Didn't push it. Didn't want to sound paranoid. Something felt off though. Things kept getting stranger. She started stepping out of the room for calls. Never did that before. Would always take calls right there on the couch. Now it was like, "Oh, let me grab this real quick." Disappear into bedroom. Or out onto the balcony. If I asked who called, just a friend from work. Always the same vague answer. Started noticing new things. Like how she always kept her phone face down. Didn't realize it was weird at first. One day reached over to hand her something. She quickly moved her phone away. One of those split-second moments. But it stuck with me. Couldn't shake the feeling something was wrong. Wasn't just the phone stuff either. She felt different. More distant. Conversations that used to flow naturally now felt like pulling teeth. Try to talk about future plans, like where to go for anniversary, or maybe getting a new car. She'd just nod. "Yeah, we'll see." Then change the subject completely. Then came this random Wednesday. She said she was meeting a friend for coffee after work. Nothing unusual about that. She did that sometimes. Happened to be running errands in that area. Thought I'd surprise her. Seemed like a good idea at the time. Maybe grab coffee together. When I got to the cafe, she wasn't with any friend. Found her outside, pacing back and forth. Phone pressed to her ear. Stayed in my car watching. Something about her body language. Just felt serious. Not like her usual self. Didn't mean to eavesdrop, but caught some weird stuff. It's almost ready. Starting fresh soon. My stomach dropped. Didn't sound like work stuff. Definitely not friend drama. Sounded bigger. More serious. Like something she'd been planning. When she got home later, asked about her coffee date. Tried to keep my voice casual. She gave this whole story about her friend having boyfriend troubles. How she was giving advice, being a good listener. Nodded along like I believed her. But my brain was working overtime. Was I reading too much into this? Overthinking everything? Or was there something deeper going on? Couldn't shake this feeling. Something was very wrong. Something she wasn't telling me. Things carried on like that for days. Started watching her behavior more closely. Not trying to catch her doing something. Just needed to make sense of everything. Of what I'd seen and heard. She wasn't being obvious about anything. But all these little things, they just didn't feel right. Then out of nowhere, she brings up our finances. We're having dinner one night. Just a regular Tuesday. Nothing special. Eating spaghetti and meatballs. Chatting about random stuff. Her workday. Some new Netflix show she wanted to watch. Then suddenly drops this bomb. "You know, we should really organize all our financial stuff." Flashes this super innocent smile. Such a random comment. Just stared at her for a second. "What do you mean?" I ask. She just shrugs. "I just think we should have everything in one place. You know, like all our account info, passwords, documents, that kind of thing. Just in case of emergency." Didn't know what to say. We'd never talked about this before. Timing felt weird, especially with everything else I'd noticed. "What kind of emergencies?" I asked. Trying to keep my voice casual. She shrugs again. "It's just smart, isn't it? What if something happens to one of us? Or what if we need to make a big financial decision quickly?" Her explanation made sense on paper, but something about how she said it put me on edge. Felt too rehearsed, too perfect, like she'd been practicing this conversation. Just nodded along, mumbled something like, "Yeah, guess that's a good idea." But inside, all these alarm bells going off. Why now? Why suddenly care about organizing finances? We'd always kept things separate. Never been an issue before. That night couldn't sleep. Kept replaying her comment. Over and over in my head, trying to figure out what it meant. Was this just normal adult stuff? Was I reading too much into it? Then thought about the phone calls, the conversation at the cafe, how distant she'd been. It all started adding up. Didn't like the picture it was painting. Until then, I hadn't done anything about it. Just watched and waited. Couple days later, she brings it up again. We're in the kitchen. I'm making a turkey sandwich. She's scrolling on her phone. Suddenly says, "Have you thought more about organizing the bank stuff? Like, do you know where all the account details are?" Put down the knife. Turned to face her. "Okay, what's going on?" Tried to keep my voice light but firm. "You've been bringing up the finances a lot lately. Is there something we need to talk about?" She finally looks up from her phone. Seems surprised. Like she didn't expect me to question it. "No, nothing's wrong," she says quickly. Gives this little fake laugh. "I just think it's important, that's all. You know, for emergencies." "Emergencies like what?" She just shrugs, face completely unreadable. "I don't know, just life stuff. It's not a big deal, I promise. I just think it's something we should get on top of." Her answer was too vague. Way too vague. Nodded and let it go. But the way she avoided giving straight answers only made me more suspicious. Didn't feel like a casual suggestion anymore. Felt like she was hiding something. Had no idea what it was, though. Next day, while she was at work, decided to take a closer look at our finances. Logged into our joint account online. Noticed something strange. Several small transfers had been made. Over the past month. Nothing huge, but didn't make sense. No labels for bills. No labels for groceries. Just random amounts going somewhere? Didn't want to jump to conclusions, but looked like she'd been moving money out. Couldn't figure out where to thaw. Thought about confronting her. Something told me to wait. If I was wrong, I'd look like a paranoid idiot. If I was right, well, needed to be careful about this. The whole thing was eating me up inside. Finally reached out to someone I trusted. Old college buddy Tom. He's a lawyer now. Told him everything I'd noticed. Tried not to sound like conspiracy theorist. Just laid out the facts. The look on his face after I finished. "I'm not saying something's definitely going on, but you're not crazy for wanting to be prepared. If you're worried about protecting your assets, now's the time to do it. Better safe than sorry." Gave me a rundown of what I could do. Simple steps to secure my finances. If something was going on, I'll admit it felt extreme. Taking steps like that felt like I was planning for disaster. Wasn't even sure anything was wrong. But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense if she was actually up to something. And I was starting to believe she needed to protect myself. Wasn't an easy decision, though. This wasn't just about money or assets. It was about our whole life together. Kept replaying memories in my head. Our wedding day? Times we stayed up late talking about dreams. All those random little jokes we shared. How did we get here? Was this really what our marriage had become? Taking these steps felt like giving up. Like admitting defeat. Like throwing away all the trust we had. That evening, while she was out, sat down at my desk, pulled out my laptop. Hands were literally shaking. As I opened the browser, started going through everything. Bank accounts, investment accounts, house deed, every single document. Each one I looked at felt like another betrayal. But this voice in my head kept reminding me. This was about survival, not about sabotage. Wasn't trying to hurt her, just couldn't shake this feeling. If I didn't act now, I'd regret it later. Made a detailed list, everything I could transfer. How to do it without raising suspicion. As I typed it all out, felt this crushing weight on my chest. Had trusted her completely for years. Now here I was, playing defense against the person I thought would always have my back. Called my mom next, didn't tell her everything, just enough to explain. "I need you to hold on to some things for me. For a while, it's nothing bad. Just something I need to do. To protect myself. Just in case." She went quiet for a moment, probably trying to figure out what I wasn't saying. "Are you okay?" she asked. Voice full of concern. "Yeah," I lied. "It's just a precaution. Nothing to worry about." She didn't push it, but could hear the hesitation when she said, "Of course, sweetheart. Whatever you need." Hanging up the phone, felt this weird mix of relief and shame. Hated involving my mom in this whole mess, but knowing she had my back gave me some stability in a situation that felt like quicksand. By the time Katie got home, had already started the process. Transferred most of my assets, savings, investments, even the house, all into my mom's name. Left enough in joint account to keep up appearances, but everything else was locked down. She didn't notice anything different. Came in like normal, kissed me on the cheek. Asked if I wanted to watch a movie. I acted normal. But inside, I was a complete mess. Part of me felt guilty, like I was betraying her trust, but another part felt relieved, like finally taking control of a situation spiraling out of hand. Over the next few days, Kept everything as normal as possible. Didn't want to tip her off that anything had changed. She seemed content, even unusually cheerful sometimes. But instead of putting me at ease, made me more suspicious. If she was planning something, she was doing an expert job hiding it. What stood out, though, she didn't bring up finances again, not even once, after I questioned her that last time. Topic completely vanished, like she'd never been interested. At first thought maybe I'd overreacted. Maybe she dropped it, because it wasn't important. But the more I thought about it, more it felt like she was avoiding it, almost like she was dreading bringing it up again. After I'd pressed her about it, caught her glancing at me sometimes, quick little looks, like she was checking my mood, or deciding whether to say something. Every time I noticed, she'd immediately turn away, back to her phone, or the TV, or whatever book she was reading. It was subtle, but it was definitely there. Felt like she was waiting for me to bring it up, like she didn't want to risk pushing the topic again. The silence about it only made me more uneasy. It wasn't like her to just drop something she thought was important. The way she avoided it now felt deliberate. If she was testing the waters, she wasn't getting in. If she was waiting for something, I wasn't about to give her the green light. Whatever her next move was, knew I needed to stay one step ahead. Something was coming. Just didn't know when or how. All I could do was prepare. That night I made sure everything was completely solid. Went over all the paperwork again, double-checking every detail of the asset transfers to my mom, the house, the savings, the investments, everything legally in her name now, locked in a trust. That couldn't be contested. Even called her to confirm. She had all documentation on her end. 2 weeks went by. Things seemed normal. Too normal, actually. She was acting more affectionate, even initiating conversations about random stuff, like work or what we should eat for dinner. It threw me off, because for months, she'd been distant, avoiding anything deeper than surface-level talk. Part of me started to wonder if I'd been overreacting all along. Maybe the weird behavior was just stress or something I couldn't understand. But then on a random Friday night, she sat me down on the couch, turned off the TV, and said we needed to talk. My stomach immediately dropped. Knew what was coming before she even said it. I think we should get a divorce. Those words hit like a truck, her tone so calm, like it was rehearsed. Not angry, not emotional, just cold, like telling me we'd run out of milk. Stared at her, unsure how to respond. As she launched into her reasoning, needed space, wanted to figure herself out, felt like she'd lost her identity. In the marriage, standard breakup lines. That didn't actually explain anything. Then she said something different, something that hit harder. You know, I've made a lot of sacrifices for you over the years, and I don't think you really appreciate them. I deserve more. That last part stung. Wasn't just about her wanting out. Was about her framing this like I owed her something, like all of this was my fault, and she was just claiming what was rightfully hers. Sat there trying to process what she was saying, but new question kept coming up. Why now? Then she dropped something that made everything click. A friend of mine has been helping me see things clearly. Wouldn't meet my eyes. A friend? Stayed quiet. Let her talk, but my mind was racing. Who was this friend? Why were they involved in my marriage? Way she said it wasn't casual. Sounded like someone had been hyping her up, convincing her that leaving me wasn't just an option, but some kind of strategy she needed to execute. The more she talked about how she deserved more because of her sacrifices, the more I couldn't believe it. Sacrifices? What sacrifices? She had been happy with me, or at least that's what she always said. I'd worked hard to give her the life she wanted, and I wasn't just talking about money. When she wanted to move closer to her job, I agreed, even though it meant a longer commute for me. When she wanted that expensive yoga retreat last year, made sure we budgeted for it. Even skipped my annual fishing trip so she could go. Supported her when she switched careers. Not once, but twice. Told her it was okay to take the leap because I wanted her to be happy. Thought being a good husband meant putting her first whenever I could. And it wasn't like I was some distant partner. I showed up, remembered anniversaries, and random little things. She mentioned liking, planned date nights. When she said she was feeling stuck, in a rut, listened to her vent about work, her friends, her family. Didn't always get it right, but always tried. That's what made her I deserve more line sting so much. I didn't buy it. Not for a second. She wasn't unhappy because of me. She was unhappy because something had changed in her. Maybe it was this friend she kept bringing up. Maybe something else. But the person sitting there wasn't the woman I married, and I wasn't going to let her rewrite our marriage story to suit her new narrative. Didn't press her in the moment. Instead, just nodded. said something neutral like, "If that's how you feel, I guess we should figure out next steps." She looked surprised that I wasn't arguing or begging her to stay. But I didn't care. My focus had shifted. Needed to know who or what was behind this sudden change, this calculated shift in her behavior. This wasn't just her waking up one day, deciding she wanted out. This was something bigger, and I wasn't going to let it blindside me anymore than it already had. After that conversation, she moved to her own apartment. By Monday, got the divorce papers. And let me tell you, they weren't just about ending things. They wanted everything. Half the house, my savings, my investments, the car, plus some vague clause about spousal support. Made no sense, given her solid income. It was like she was swinging for the fences, expecting me to roll over and hand her everything I'd worked for. At first thought, she was just being vindictive, but the way she framed her demands, so detailed and aggressive, made me sure someone was coaching her through this. So I started digging. Couldn't just ask her who she'd been talking to. Had to get creative. Started with her social media. She hadn't blocked me, didn't post often, but went through her tagged photos and comments, looking for anyone new. That's when I noticed a pattern. Someone named Brian kept liking and commenting on her posts, nothing inappropriate, just enough to make me pause. Clicked his profile. It was public. Didn't seem like much at first. Guy in his 30s, working in real estate, according to his bio, but as I scrolled through his feed, noticed something strange. He'd posted a photo at the same cafe I'd seen her at weeks ago. On the same day, I overheard her talking about starting fresh. My stomach churned. As I kept scrolling, there were more subtle hints. A comment on one of her posts, saying, "You've got this," and a selfie he'd posted from what looked like her new apartment. None of it was concrete proof, but it was enough to make me suspicious. I wasn't sure what to do with this information, but knew I couldn't just sit there, waiting for answers to fall in my lap. Her mention of a friend, helping her through things, had stuck with me. Needed to know who it was. Decided to call one of our mutual friends. Lisa had been close with Katie for years. If anyone knew what was going on, it would be her. Kept the conversation casual at first, just asking if she'd talked to Katie recently, or if anything seemed off. Lisa responded quickly, said she didn't know anything about a friend, or any advice. Asked a few more questions, trying to probe deeper, but she shut down the conversation, really defensively, like she was trying to avoid getting involved, not ready to give up. Called another friend, Emily this time, went through the same routine, explaining I was just trying to make sense of everything. At first she seemed hesitant, dodging my questions, with vague answers. When I pressed her a bit more, she ended the call abruptly, left me more suspicious than ever. Sat there frustrated, trying to figure out what my next move should be. Then, to my surprise, Emily called me back, said she needed to make sure whatever she said wouldn't get back to her. I promised it wouldn't. After a long pause, she finally told me what she knew. Apparently, Katie had been spending a lot of time with Brian, someone she'd met through work. Emily said she didn't know much else, but from what she'd heard, Brian was deeply involved in the advice Katie was getting about the divorce. Hearing that name again felt like a piece of the puzzle finally clicking into place. Now it was clear. This wasn't just about her needing space or finding herself. Someone else was in the picture, steering her decisions, and I was determined to find out why. Decided to confront it my own way. That weekend, drove to her apartment building, parked a block away, hoping to confirm what I already knew. Sure enough, a couple hours later, she walked out of the building with Brian. They didn't hold hands or anything, but the way they walked together, close, leaning in to talk, was enough. They got into his car, a black BMW, and drove off. Didn't follow them. Didn't need to. At that moment, it was crystal clear. She hadn't just fallen out of love with me. She'd been planning her exit with someone else, and now it all made sense. The sudden distance, the financial questions, the aggressive demands in the divorce papers. She wasn't just leaving me. She was trying to leave me with nothing. And she had someone backing her every step of the way. First mediation session was tense. From the moment we walked in, her lawyer showed up with a folder so thick, looked like they were filing a lawsuit against a Fortune 500 company. He started going through her demands, like they were completely reasonable. Half the house, the savings, my investments, the car, even some additional nonsense about spousal support. I stayed quiet, pretending to listen, but I was waiting for my lawyer to make his move. When it was finally our turn, he calmly slid a stack of documents across the table and said, "Before we proceed, I think it's important for everyone to review these." Her lawyer picked up the papers, started skimming through them. His confident demeanor shifted quickly. as he flipped the pages, his brows furrowing deeper with each one. "What is this?" he asked. "These documents show the transfer of all major assets into a trust under my client's mother's name," my lawyer explained, voice steady. "The transfers were completed several weeks before the divorce filing, and the trust is fully legal and irrevocable." The room went completely silent. Her lawyer turned to her, his confusion now mixed with frustration. "You didn't mention this," he said flatly. Katie snatched the papers from his hands, flipped through them, her face turning red. "This can't be real," she muttered, staring at the notarized signatures and dates. Then she turned to me, her expression shifting from disbelief to pure fury. "You planned this," she hissed, glaring at me like I'd committed some unforgivable crime. "You knew I was going to file, and you set this up to screw me over?" I didn't respond, just sat there, letting her connect the dots on her own. Her lawyer, now visibly annoyed, asked my lawyer to explain further. So he did. Calmly, methodically, with every piece of proof needed to make the transfers ironclad. The dates lined up perfectly, showing I'd moved everything. Well, before she filed, signatures were properly notarized, and the trust was airtight. There was nothing they could do to contest it. She was absolutely livid. "You're unbelievable," she snapped, leaning forward in her chair. "I can't believe you'd do something like this to me." I still didn't say a word. What was there to say? This wasn't about me doing something to her. This was about protecting myself, because she'd made it clear she wasn't leaving quietly. Meeting ended with her lawyer muttering something about needing to reassess their approach, but obvious to everyone in the room. They had no moves left to make. When we walked out of the building, she pulled me aside in the hallway, her face a mix of anger and desperation. "This isn't over," she said, voice low and threatening. "You're going to regret this?" I just looked at her and said, "I already regret trusting you. That's the only regret I have." After that mediation session, things spiraled faster than I expected. She went into full meltdown mode, almost immediately. Started with endless calls. At first, she sounded calm, even apologetic, leaving voicemails like, "I think we just need to talk. I know this got messy, but we can fix it." When I didn't respond, the tone shifted dramatically. By the second day, her messages were bouncing between sobbing and screaming. One voicemail would be her crying about how she made a mistake, didn't want to lose everything we built together. The next would be an angry tirade, accusing me of being stingy and vindictive, blaming me for everything going wrong in her life. I ignored it all. My lawyer advised me not to engage, and honestly, I didn't want to. I was done playing her games, but she wasn't done. When the calls and texts didn't work, she started spinning stories, started hearing from mutual friends that she'd been telling people the divorce wasn't real, that it had all been some elaborate prank. A prank. I mean, who would even believe that? Who files actual legal paperwork for a prank? Who hires a lawyer and makes specific demands? If it wasn't serious, when people didn't buy the prank excuse right away, she doubled down hard, claimed it wasn't just a joke, but a way to test the strength of our relationship. Started painting herself as the victim, saying she was hurt and betrayed by my reaction, that I'd taken things too far and destroyed the trust in our marriage. At first, some people seemed to buy into her stories, started getting these weird texts from acquaintances saying things like, "Wow, didn't realize things were so rough for her." Even her brother lashed out, saying I should have just talked it out. Instead of being so drastic, it was frustrating. But I knew the truth would come out eventually, and it did, thanks to one of our mutual friends. Let's call him David. David and I weren't super close, but we'd always been friendly. Couple weeks after the mediation, he messaged me out of the blue, said he had something I needed to see. When we met up, he pulled out his phone, showed me a string of texts between Katie and Brian. I was confused at first. "How did you even get these?" I asked, scrolling through messages. David explained. He had a mutual friend with Brian, someone who had been privy to their conversations. Apparently, this mutual friend started feeling uneasy about how things were playing out, especially when Brian began bragging about how he was helping her secure her future. Didn't take long for that friend to connect the dots, realize what securing her future actually meant. Trying to bleed me dry, feeling guilty about staying silent. The friend took screenshots of all their texts, shared them with David, knowing he had a better relationship with me and might be able to warn me. "This guy's been playing both sides," David said, shaking his head. "He's been hyping her up to take you for everything, while making her believe he'd be there for her afterward. David handed me his phone and said, "Thought you should know. You don't deserve this, man." The texts were absolutely brutal. She wasn't just venting to Brian about the divorce. She was actively planning her next moves with him, and he was coaching her through it. One of her messages said, "Once the settlement's done, we'll have everything we need. I just need him to agree to the terms." Brian's reply was worse. "Don't back down. Make him feel guilty if you have to. He owes you. We'll start fresh once you've got the money." Sat there staring at David's phone, trying to process what I was reading. This wasn't a misunderstanding or some emotional reaction to a failing marriage. This was cold, calculated manipulation. I thanked David and he left, but my mind was spinning. Everything made sense now. Her sudden distance, her obsession with our finances, her aggressive demands in the divorce. It had all been part of a plan, one she'd been working on. With Brian behind the scenes, the texts spread quickly. Among our mutual friends, David shared them with a few people. From there, they made the rounds. Suddenly, her narrative wasn't holding up anymore. People who'd been neutral, or even supportive of her, started pulling away. The shift was almost instant. The ones who had been defending her, or staying on the fence, now saw her for who she really was. Even her closest allies started distancing themselves. By the time divorce was finalized, she had nothing but her personal belongings. Her lawyer quietly dropped her case after realizing there wasn't a legal leg to stand on. All those bold demands had crumbled under the weight of the paperwork I'd prepared, and the trust I'd set up with my mom was untouchable. As for Brian, he seemed to vanish the moment things started unraveling. I wouldn't be surprised if he'd been using her just as much as she'd been using me. From what I could piece together, he'd been feeding her delusions of independence and a fresh start. But the second it became clear, she wasn't walking away with anything. He was gone. Without Brian in her corner, her confidence took a nosedive. The calls and texts kept coming. But now they were more desperate. "Can we just talk, please? I'll do anything to fix this." One voicemail said. Another begged, "You don't have to forgive me, but can't we just settle this and move on? I'll drop everything. If you just talk to me." I didn't respond. I couldn't. The damage was done. There was no coming back from it. Even her family started to pull away. Her brother reached out to me, apologizing for some things he'd said earlier. When he believed her side, "I didn't know what she was doing to you." He admitted, "I'm sorry I ever took her word for it." As for me, I got the house, my savings, and something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace of mind. My mom, as always, was my rock. She came over with buckets of paint and a list of ideas to help me reclaim the space as my own. Now life feels like it's finally mine again. No more second guessing every little interaction. No more feeling betrayed. Just peace. She's a chapter in my past, one I don't reread anymore. And as far as I'm concerned, the rest of the story is entirely mine to write.